How many eyes does a Cyclops have? On the surface of it, this is the stupidest question ever asked. Cyclopses are rather famous for the whole one eye thing. But for millennia, scholars have noted Homer never actually says that they have one eye, and we have ancient Greek and Roman artistic and literary evidence for Cyclopses with one, two, even three eyes. So what's going on? First, a rundown of the relevant part of the Odyssey. Odysseus and his crew reach the home of the Cyclops, and a group goes to check things out. And for storytelling reasons, they bring along some really strong wine. Odysseus sees a Cyclops, who will learn is named Polyphemus, tending to his flocks and living apart from the others. And then Odysseus and his red shirts go into a cave, eat some cheese, and then Polyphemus shows up, goes into the cave, and moves an absolutely massive boulder in front of the cave entrance. Polyphemus then talks to Odysseus, eats a bunch of his men, then decides to take a break. Odysseus thinks he should stab Polyphemus, but realizes that they'd never be able to move the boulder blocking the cave. So Odysseus formulates a plan. After Polyphemus leaves the next day, Odysseus and his surviving men take a massive hunk of wood and sharpen it. When Polyphemus returns the next day, they offer him this ultra mega strong wine. He gets drunk, they spear his eye. Polyphemus gets up, moves the rock blocking the cave entrance, and as his rams are leaving, Odysseus and his surviving men hide underneath them and escape. There are more relevant details in Homer, but we'll get to those as needed. And if you're furiously typing out some super important part of the story I missed, I thank you for the engagement. There are two main reasons to expect Homer wants us to think Polyphemus has one eye. For one, they take a stick and do a single blinding action. There's no hint in the story that the stick is forked or anything like that, so that strongly suggests they only impaled one eyeball. But in that case, it's a sort of reverse Chekhov's gun. Homer doesn't mention something that in a later scene will be of critical importance. That's odd. The second reason is that in the Greek, Homer uses the singular eye. However, he also uses the Greek equivalent of plural eyebrows and eyelids. And people noticed this. One ancient commentator guessed that Polyphemus actually had two eyes, but one had previously been injured. There's basically no support for that idea, but it shows that people in the ancient world aren't necessarily thinking one giant eye in the center of the head is a prerequisite for being a Cyclops. Another theory is that everyone knew that Cyclopses only had one eye, so there wasn't a reason to mention this fact. But in that case, why do so many other, later adaptations feel the need to say this explicitly? Surely a modern audience definitely knows that Cyclopses have one eye, yet we feel the need to point this out. Homer is a bit of a dead end at this point, so let's look around at other authors. It'll help. Homer's Cyclopses aren't the only Cyclopses in ancient Greece. For a long time, people have tended to think that there are at least three sort of species of Cyclopses. The most relevant for us are the vaguely similarly ancient Hesiads. Hesiod wrote the Theogony, and unlike Homer, his Cyclopses are explicitly one-eyed. In the words of one translation, "Then brought she forth next the Cyclopses. Now these were in other respects, it is true, like to the gods, but a single eye was fixed in their mid-foreheads. And Cyclopses was their appropriate name, because in their foreheads one circular eye was fixed. Eventually, they'll give the thunderbolt to Zeus and help him defeat his enemies. So we're good, right? Well, not really. For the name, Hesiod basically just says, oh, and they have one eye and that's the origin of their name. Except the weird part is there's not a reason for them to have one eye. It doesn't come up again, and unlike in Homer, it's not relevant for storytelling reasons. It's just an etymology. It's not impossible that this is evidence Homer predates Hesiod, and Hesiod was continuing the tradition of one-eyed Cyclopses. But it's also been noted, Hesiod's anecdote about the Cyclopses and another group called the Hundred Handers is really awkward. If you take it out, the story flows just fine, and if you leave it in, there are difficult questions regarding how everything plays out. For these and other reasons, some scholars have argued that there might be something funky going on in this section. You have to remember, we don't have the papyrus or parchment or whatever that Hesiod was writing on. What we have are copies of copies, in this case mostly medieval and post-medieval copies of copies. And copying is rarely perfectly faithful. I've done it, and you really want to write things in your own voice or clarify details, all sorts. If you have a bunch of data, you can generally say, oh, this sentence is a later addition. But sometimes that's really hard to do. And in this case, there's disagreement whether there's some fiddling, no fiddling, or what's going on in this section. If there's fiddling, one of our strongest pieces of evidence that Cyclopses as a group have one eye in the earliest layers of the myth is thrown out the window. If it is actually original to what Hesiod wrote, it's solid evidence that Cyclopses have one eyes, because Homer and Hesiod would seem to agree on this point. You can find scholars arguing basically every point along that spectrum, including the rather odd idea that it is a later addition, but a later addition by Hesiod himself. The idea in that case would be, as he was finishing up the story, he realized he messed up by not properly introducing the Cyclopses and Hundred-Handers, and went back and awkwardly shoehorned them in. No matter what, Hesiod's Cyclopses are incredibly and irreconcilably different from Homer's Cyclopses. Hesiod tells us there are 3 Cyclopses, none of which are Polyphemus. Hesiod's Cyclops' parents are Uranos and Gaia. At least Polyphemus' parents are Poseidon and Thoosa. Even some ancient Greeks wondered how Polyphemus could be a Cyclops if he lacks any familial relationship to the Cyclopses. More differences. Hesiod's Cyclopses ally with Zeus. Homer's Cyclopses explicitly don't care about Zeus. That one is doubly odd, because in the words of one translation of the Odyssey, these people, meaning the Cyclopses, neither plow nor plant, but everything grows for them unsown. Wheat, barley, and vines that bear, clusters of grapes, watered by rain from Zeus. So they entirely depend on Zeus providing rains, yet they hate Zeus. This makes no sense. That means some scholars, such as Robert Mundy, have suggested that what you're seeing in Homer is a sort of fusion of a few different stories. One story is that Hesiod's Cyclopses are rewarded for helping Zeus and sent to a paradise where they don't have to toil the ground. The section of the Odyssey I just quoted is an echo of that tradition. The second part is, let's go to Iceland. There's an Icelandic saga called Hrolf's Saga Gautreks, and here's how a 1972 translation describes one of his adventures. King Hrolf and his men go out sailing when a strong wind blows them to a random island that they decide to check out. They find a giant house with a massive door that nobody, except King Hrolf, because he's hard as nails, can open. They go inside and everything is absolutely gigantic, including a massive sword. Anyway, then the owner of the house comes in, and it turns out he's a giant. Now, this giant has a grudge against King Hrolf, so basically thinks, let me think about what horrible things I can do to you. But in the meantime, he takes a gigantic forked iron rod and impales some of Hrolf's men and throws them into the fire. But he needs to sleep on what he's going to do to Hrolf and his main companion, so he closes the door and goes to bed. Hrolf grabs the massive sword and tells his companion to keep the iron fork in the fire. Then, simultaneously, Hrolf stabs the giant near the liver, while his companion stabs the fork in the giant's eyes. The giant gets up and starts thrashing around to try to kill our heroes, but then succumbs to his wound and crashes into the door, shattering it. A few more things happen, but that's pretty much it for the meat of the story. There are some striking similarities. A group finds themselves at a random location, giant monster, a door that's unopenable, poking out eyes because just stabbing the giant would make it so that they couldn't ever leave. There's even quite a lot of talk about hospitality. It's beyond the scope of this video to talk about that, but the Cyclops story in the Odyssey is mostly about hospitality, which is a really big deal for a very long time. Anyway, there are also some key differences. For instance, in at least this translation, he has 2 eyes, though you have to be profoundly careful with making any form of argument from translation, so I'm not going to put any emphasis on that detail. The Icelandic version also doesn't have the famous no man scene, but lots of other stories do have that scene, and scholars have found dozens and dozens of stories with very similar elements to Homer's Cyclops story from an incredibly diverse range of countries and cultures. This has led to theories, going back to Robert Mundy's idea that you have the story of Zeus sending Hesiod Cyclopses to a paradise, and then that story gets merged with an ancient folk tale of an ogre being blinded, and this merged story is what gets put in the Odyssey. Why doesn't Homer say that Cyclopses have one eye? Mundy thinks it's because Cyclopses don't have one eye. Polyphemus has one eye for narrative reasons, but saying, oh, yeah, he has one eye would mess with the flow and lead to questions about how he lost the other eye. Better in that case to just be vague and hope nobody notices, and then throw in a singular eye to make sure the audience knows. Sure, people might write articles about 5 plot holes in the Odyssey, but A, we know people were discussing this plot hole in the ancient world, and B, you get those articles about modern books and movies because sometimes explaining everything just isn't the story you want to tell. Then, because of Homer's popularity, what becomes a distinguishing trait of Polyphemus becomes a generic trait of all Cyclopses. At some point in the manuscript tradition of Hesiod, someone comes up with the etymology, props that in there, and later copyists then integrate that into the main text, and we're off to the races. Now to throw some cold water on everything. Scholar Peter Aker argues that the people who think Cyclopses are living in some paradise misunderstand. Nowadays we think, oh, wheat and grape growing unsown sounds like a paradise. But to a contemporary of Homer, the implication would be that they're basically one step up from animals and depending on nature to survive. Or perhaps it's a confusion based on conflating what the poet narrator says, which is that it's really top-notch land, with what Polyphemus says, that they don't care about the gods. And because they're different speakers, there's no contradiction. As for the myriad of strikingly similar stories, well, Homer had been really, really popular for well over 1,000 years before the oldest of these stories was collected, and that's plenty of time for his story of the Cyclops to spread far and wide and get adjusted to local tastes. Earlier folklorists thought that folktales were remarkably stable over long periods of time, so that wasn't a concern. Modern folklorists don't particularly think this, so are willing to say these striking similarities are because they're rip-offs. That's not to throw the idea completely out, because there are old ancient Greek depictions of the blinding event that have some notable differences from Homer's, but it's hard to tell what's a variation, what's artistic license, and what's a completely different tradition. Some depictions seem to have the pokey thing looking forked, like it is in the Icelandic story, so they can poke out 2 eyes. And some artistic depictions certainly look like the Cyclops has 3 eyes, and the blinding action is often directed at eye number 3. We even have textual evidence. A commentary on the Aeneid says that some say Polyphemus had 1 eye, others 2, others 3. So, how many eyes does a Cyclops have? Unclear. They will eventually become one-eyed, but at our earliest level of myth, all we can say for certain is that one particular Cyclops was one-eyed. Probably.